The forest has always carried two faces. In the light of day, it is a place of freedom, winding trails that lead upward into clean air, rivers that sing through valleys, and endless trees that have stood longer than memory itself. People come here to escape the noise of the city, to breathe, to reset. But when the light fades, the woods are different. The silence is heavier, the shadows longer. Every path looks the same, and the deeper you go, the easier it is to forget how to get out. It was in these woods, in the quiet corners of America's national forests, that a predator waited. He was not a monster you'd spot instantly in a crowd. He looked like an aging drifter, gray hair thinning, clothes worn, his small dog padding along faithfully at his side. To passing hikers, he was just another outdoorsman, another wanderer who lived in the simplicity of nature. But Gary Michael Hilton was watching, and he was waiting. Between 2007 and 2008, hikers began to vanish from the trails of Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida. Their disappearances seemed, at first, to be tragic accidents: an elderly couple who lost their way, a woman delayed on a hike, a nurse who never came home from her walk. But then bodies began to appear, hidden beneath leaves, abandoned in forests, scarred by violence. The man behind them would be remembered as the National Forest serial killer. Investigators would later learn that Hilton's crimes were as opportunistic as they were chilling. He didn't stalk the cities. He didn't prowl suburban neighborhoods. He hunted in the open, under the cover of trees and wilderness, in places where people felt safest. Trails became traps. Campgrounds became cages. The silence of the woods became the perfect stage for murder. When the FBI pieced the story together, the picture was horrifying. Hilton didn't kill in a frenzy. He killed with patience, with calculation. He took his victims' money, their belongings, and then their lives, burying his secrets in the soil of the forests he haunted. But the story of Gary Hilton is not just one of crime. It is also a story of a chase, a desperate, multi-state manhunt to catch a predator who could disappear into the trees at will. A battle of wits between a killer who thrived on manipulation and investigators determined to drag him out of the shadows. In the end, Hilton's downfall came not just from science or surveillance cameras, but from his own arrogance, the way he thought he could play games in an interrogation room, the way he thought he could outsmart the law. This is the story of Gary Hilton, a drifter who turned America's wilderness into a killing ground, a man who appeared harmless, even kind, as he walked with his dog down the same trails as his victims, and a killer who proved that sometimes the most peaceful places hide the darkest dangers. To understand the predator who would one day haunt America's national forests, you have to begin with a boy, an angry, unstable child who grew into a drifter, always running, always hiding. Gary Michael Hilton was born in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1946. He never knew stability. His father abandoned the family early, and young Gary grew up in a house where tempers flared more than laughter. Neighbors remembered him as restless, unpredictable. By age 12, the instability had boiled into violence. In one shocking moment, Gary picked up a gun and shot his stepfather. The man survived, but Hilton was taken into psychiatric care. For weeks, he was evaluated, watched by doctors who tried to measure the depth of his rage. But the system let him slip. Hilton walked out with no long-term treatment. It was the first time he was caught and the first time he got away. As a young man, Hilton joined the U.S. Army. He was assigned to the elite 82nd Airborne Division paratroopers who were expected to be disciplined, sharp, and reliable. Hilton did not last. He clashed with authority, grew erratic, and was eventually court-martialed. The Army discharged him dishonorably. Back in civilian life, Hilton bounced from job to job, never holding steady work. He married, then divorced. Married again, then divorced again. Friends described him as charming for a few hours, then unbearable. He was paranoid, prone to long rants about conspiracies and enemies who didn't exist. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Hilton lived as though the world owed him something. He threatened neighbors, harassed coworkers, and made enemies wherever he went. Arrests came and went, minor charges, disputes, but nothing that kept him locked away. Each time, he slipped back into the shadows, untethered, unpredictable. By the early 2000s, Hilton had stripped his life down to almost nothing. He was living out of a white Chevrolet Astro van, a vehicle that became both his home and his hunting blind. His constant companion was a dog, a tan hound named Dandy. Together, they wandered from one national forest to another. Campers and hikers remembered Hilton as the odd man who lingered at trailheads, asking questions, hovering too close. His dog disarmed suspicion. People thought he was just lonely, maybe eccentric, maybe homeless. Few guessed the truth that Hilton wasn't just camping. He was watching. Psychologists later called Hilton a parasitic drifter. He had no steady income, no savings, no plan for the future. He lived by taking what he could from others. At first, it was money, shelter, favors. Eventually, it became lives. His behavior grew darker. He often boasted to acquaintances about survival skills, about how easy it would be to live off the land, to disappear in the woods. He bragged about hunting not just animals, but the idea of hunting people. Some brushed it off as eccentric talk. Others kept their distance. But Hilton was serious. The forests were the one place where Hilton felt in control. The silence suited him. The endless trails meant freedom. And most importantly, the wilderness gave him victims, people isolated, unprotected, with no witnesses. By 2007, Hilton was in his 60s. To strangers, he looked like a washed-up old man with a mutt. In truth, he was sharpening his methods. He had learned how to approach hikers, how to gain their trust, how to walk close enough to strike when no one was watching. That fall, Hilton's violent fantasies became reality. In North Carolina, an elderly couple named John and Irene Bryant would cross paths with him on the trail. And Hilton would prove what investigators later said about him. He was a predator who had been rehearsing all his life. It was a crisp autumn morning in Hendersonville, North Carolina. John and Irene Bryant were getting ready for what they loved most, a hike together in the mountains. They had been married for more than 50 years. John was 80, Irene was 84, and they were still inseparable. Friends described them as kind, active, and full of life. The forest was their shared sanctuary. That day, they chose Pisgah National Forest, a stretch of wilderness filled with waterfalls, switchbacks, and towering trees. They had walked those trails countless times before. To their family, it seemed like the safest place an elderly couple could be. But when night fell and the Bryants didn't come home, worry turned into alarm. Their car was still at the trailhead, the forest silent. At first, rescue crews believed the couple had gotten lost. Helicopters flew overhead. Searchers called out their names. Dogs sniffed through brush. For days, volunteers scoured the woods. They hoped to find John and Irene disoriented, maybe injured, but alive. Instead, they found tragedy. Not far from the trail, hidden under leaves and branches, lay the body of Irene Bryant. She had been struck with brutal force. The medical examiner later confirmed her skull had been fractured. She had been beaten to death. John was missing. The discovery sent a chill through the community. Pisgah National Forest wasn't just a park, it was practically the backyard of Hendersonville. The Bryants weren't reckless adventurers. They were grandparents out for a day's walk. Now Irene was gone, and John had vanished without a trace. The question was, had someone taken him? Days turned into weeks. Then came the first sign that John might still be alive, or at least that his identity was being used. His ATM card was suddenly active. Transactions appeared in Tennessee, then in Georgia. Surveillance cameras captured a thin man with graying hair withdrawing cash. His face was partially shadowed by a cap, but investigators could see enough. The footage was broadcast, circulated, studied. Locals began to murmur. Some thought they recognized the drifter they'd seen hanging around trailheads, the man with the van and the dog. His name, they said, was Gary Hilton. But the ATM withdrawals weren't just about theft. They formed a trail, a moving line southward, as if Hilton was leaving breadcrumbs of his crimes across state lines. Still, John Bryant had not been found. His children and grandchildren clung to hope. Maybe he had been taken captive. Maybe he was still alive. Every news report reopened the wound. That hope ended in February 2008, almost 4 months after the couple vanished. Deep in Nanahala National Forest, searchers came across human remains. They belonged to John Bryant. He had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber firearm. The evidence was grim but conclusive. Hilton had attacked the Bryants on the trail, beaten Irene to death, then forced John to withdraw money before killing him. Forensic testing later tied Hilton's .22 to the fatal shot. The randomness of the crime horrified investigators. There was no personal connection, no vendetta. The Bryants simply happened to cross paths with a predator in the woods. For their family, the pain was immeasurable. To live long lives, to stay healthy into their 80s, only to be cut down by a stranger with a gun. It felt senseless. For the FBI, the case carried a different weight. The brutality suggested Hilton wasn't just desperate for money. He was practicing control, testing himself. And this was only the beginning. The Bryants were Hilton's first confirmed victims. But as agents would soon learn, he had already set his eyes on others. The forests of Florida and then Georgia were next. For most people, New Year's Day means family gatherings, resolutions, or watching football from the couch. But for 24-year-old Meredith Emerson, it meant lacing up her boots, leashing her dog Ella, and heading into the mountains. Meredith was vibrant, athletic, and fiercely independent. Friends described her as unstoppable, strong-willed, determined, a woman who faced life head-on. Hiking was her way of recharging, and Blood Mountain in Georgia was one of her favorite trails. That morning, the air was cold and clear. The trailhead parking lot was busy with hikers, but as Meredith climbed higher, the crowd thinned. Witnesses remembered seeing her, smiling, moving with confidence, her black Labrador mix trotting at her side. But they remembered something else too. A man older, gaunt, with thinning gray hair walking behind her. He had a dog of his own, a red setter mix named Dandy. He seemed harmless, just another hiker. By evening, Meredith hadn't come home. Her friends called her phone. No answer. When hours passed, they reported her missing. The search began immediately. Helicopters circled the ridge. Search and rescue teams combed the woods, and volunteers called her name through the trees. Blood Mountain was blanketed with people desperate to find her. Her car was still at the trailhead, but Meredith was gone. 3 days later, police spotted a familiar face at a gas station. The drifter, Gary Hilton. He was cleaning out his white Astro van. Witnesses saw him dumping items into a trash bin. Investigators moved in after he drove off. Inside the bin, they found a backpack, clothing, and blood-stained rags. Among them were Meredith's belongings, proof that Hilton had been with her. The hunt was now focused. Hilton was arrested on January 4th. His van was searched. Inside, investigators found duct tape, gloves, and Meredith's dog collar. But there was still no sign of Meredith herself. Then came a moment of relief and heartbreak combined. Hilton had abandoned Ella, Meredith's black lab, in a grocery store parking lot. The dog was alive, hungry but unharmed. Someone had taken her in. For Meredith's family, Ella's survival gave a shred of hope. But where was Meredith? In a stark interrogation room. Hilton slouched in his chair, arms crossed, eyes darting from wall to wall. He seemed almost amused by the attention. Detectives pressed him. They laid out the evidence. The ATM footage of Hilton withdrawing cash from Meredith's account. The items from the gas station trash, stained with her blood. Eyewitnesses who had seen Hilton trailing her on the mountain. At first, Hilton deflected. "You can't prove anything," he muttered. He smirked, shrugged, acted like a man who thought he still held the cards. But as hours passed, the cracks appeared. He grew restless. His voice sharpened. He leaned forward and whispered his condition. "You want her body? Take the death penalty off the table." Detectives fell silent. Hilton wasn't bargaining for freedom. He was bargaining for his life. After tense negotiations, a deal was struck. Hilton would lead authorities to Meredith's body in exchange for a sentence of life in prison instead of death. The next day, investigators followed Hilton deep into Dawson Forest. The air was bitter cold. The woods were silent. Hilton led them to a spot covered with branches and leaves. There, they found Meredith's remains. The horror was confirmed. Hilton had held her captive for several days before killing her. The autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the head. News of Meredith's death shook Georgia. She had been young, strong, capable. If someone like her could be taken from a crowded trail in broad daylight, then no one was truly safe. Vigils were held. Strangers left flowers and candles at the trailhead where her car had been parked. Ella, the dog, was returned to Meredith's family, becoming a living link to her final moments. For investigators, Hilton's confession was a breakthrough. It not only closed Meredith's case, but tied Hilton to others. His face, now plastered across national news, was familiar to law enforcement in Florida and North Carolina. The puzzle pieces fell into place. Hilton hadn't just killed in Georgia. He had killed before. Later reports revealed chilling details of Hilton's behavior. He had approached Meredith on the trail, striking a conversation, walking close enough that she couldn't shake him. At some point, he brandished a knife and forced her off the path. For days, he kept her alive, moving between locations, using her cards to withdraw money. Some investigators believe Meredith tried to resist, even to outsmart him, delaying him long enough for police to close in. But Hilton was relentless. When he realized time was running out, he killed her and hid her body. The mask of the harmless old hiker with a dog had finally been ripped away. Behind it was a predator who had perfected the art of blending in, waiting for the right moment to strike. Meredith Emerson's murder was the turning point in Hilton's spree. What first looked like a single abduction unraveled into a multi-state killing trail. The FBI connected him to the Bryants in North Carolina and Cheryl Dunlap in Florida. Hilton was no longer a suspect in one disappearance. He was a serial killer, and his downfall began with Meredith, a strong young woman whose case revealed the monster hiding behind a friendly smile on a trail. By the time Meredith Emerson's body was recovered in Dawson Forest, detectives knew they were not dealing with a single, isolated crime. The evidence taken from Gary Hilton's van blood traces, duct tape, Meredith's belongings was damning enough. But as investigators traced his movements, a wider pattern began to emerge. The FBI stepped in. Their job: connect the dots across state lines. At first, the puzzle looked messy. 3 different states, 3 different victims, but the methods were strikingly similar. Each victim had been hiking in a national forest. Each was found days later, hidden beneath leaves or burned to obscure evidence. Each case involved missing bank cards used at ATMs. Agents began with the Bryant case. John Bryant's ATM card had been used in Tennessee and Georgia shortly after his disappearance. Surveillance cameras showed a thin man with thinning gray hair and a baseball cap, glancing nervously over his shoulder as he withdrew cash. When those still images were placed next to newer footage from Georgia Hilton withdrawing Meredith's money, there was no doubt. The man was the same. It was Hilton. The withdrawals formed a trail across the southeast. It was as if Hilton had left a breadcrumb path of his crimes, each transaction narrowing the timeline. Next came the van. Hilton's white Chevrolet Astro had been seen near Blood Mountain, near Pisgah National Forest, and near Apalachicola in Florida. Witnesses recalled it parked at trailheads for hours, Hilton and his dog nearby. When investigators searched the van, it told its own story. Inside were gloves, rope, duct tape, and machete items Hilton insisted were for camping. But to detectives, they looked like a killer's kit. Blood samples taken from the carpet matched Meredith Emerson. Fibers matched items from other victims. The van wasn't just transportation. It was a mobile crime scene. Even Hilton's dog, Dandy, played a part. Hikers had remembered the old man with a setter mix trailing them on paths. The dog disarmed suspicion, made Hilton look harmless, even friendly. But in the end, Dandy became a marker. Whenever reports came in about a drifter with a dog loitering at campsites, investigators knew they were closing in. Forensic science sealed the case, showing that DNA taken from Meredith's clothing matched Hilton. A hair sample from a van linked him to Cheryl Dunlap's murder in Florida. Ballistics matched Hilton's .22 caliber firearm to the fatal shot that killed John Bryant. Each test drew the net tighter. But Hilton wasn't a calculating mastermind. He was sloppy. He left traces wherever he went: surveillance footage, receipts, gas station sightings, DNA in his van. To investigators, it was like chasing a man who thought he could outrun evidence itself. Back in Georgia, Hilton had already confessed to Meredith Emerson's murder under the plea deal. But investigators wanted more. They pressed him about the Bryants. They pressed him about Cheryl Dunlap. Hilton squirmed. He shifted his story, denied, then bragged, then denied again. Detectives noticed how he enjoyed the game, how he leaned back with a smirk one moment, then erupted in anger the next. He wanted control, even in chains. But every time they placed another photo on the table, ATM stills, forensic results, maps, his confidence slipped. Florida agents built their case around the disappearance of Cheryl Dunlap, a 46-year-old nurse and Sunday school teacher who vanished in December 2007 while walking in Apalachicola National Forest. Her car was found abandoned. Days later, her body was discovered, partially burned. Hilton's DNA was on the remains. ATM footage showed him using her card. His van had been spotted in the area. As the story broke, the public reaction was immediate. National news outlets called Hilton the National Forest serial killer. Hikers canceled trips. Families stayed away from trails. The idea that an elderly drifter could stalk America's wilderness and murder strangers for money horrified the country. Searchers who had once volunteered in Pisgah and Dawson Forest now realized they had been combing trails that were also Hilton's crime scenes. When all the evidence was laid out, DNA, ATM footage, the van, ballistics, Hilton's own confession, his fate was sealed. Prosecutors in Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina prepared their trials. Hilton's spree had lasted less than a year, but in that time, he had turned 3 forests into places of terror. With Gary Hilton condemned in 3 different states, the courts had spoken. He was finished. But the question remained: what kind of man becomes a national forest serial killer? The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit studied Hilton closely. What they saw wasn't a meticulous mastermind like Bundy or a sadistic planner like BTK. Hilton was different. He was what agents called an opportunistic predator, a man who killed not out of compulsion alone, but out of circumstance and desperation. Hilton had lived his entire adult life drifting from one place to another. No steady job, no stable home, no long-term relationships. He relied on others for survival, borrowing money, overstaying his welcome, manipulating friends. When those lifelines dried up, he turned to strangers. Psychologists called him a parasitic drifter, a man who survived by feeding off those around him until there was nothing left to take. And in 2007, when his resources ran out, Hilton escalated. His method was chilling in its simplicity. He sought out hikers alone, elderly, or vulnerable deep in national forests. He struck when they were far from help, forcing them to give up their bank cards and PIN numbers. He used the cards at ATMs, then silenced his victims to erase witnesses. It wasn't a complex plan, but it worked. The woods gave him cover. The trails gave him victims. But money wasn't the whole story. Interrogators who spent hours with Hilton describe a man who craved control. He toyed with detectives, smirking one moment, exploding with anger the next. Even in chains, he wanted to be the one setting the rules. Investigators believe Hilton kept some victims alive for days, not because he needed to, but because he liked it. He liked the fear. He liked knowing that in the silence of the forest, he was the only one with power. That sadistic streak made him more dangerous than a robber. He wasn't just stealing money. He was stealing lives to feel in control. The FBI also asked another question. Were there more victims? Hilton was 61 years old when he killed Meredith Emerson. That left decades of unaccounted for time. Dozens of unsolved disappearances from the 1980s and 1990s fit his profile: hikers gone missing in remote forests, cars abandoned at trailheads, no suspects ever found. To this day, no definitive evidence ties Hilton to those earlier cases. But investigators believe it is unlikely that a man like Hilton only began killing in his 60s. It is possible that there are victims of Gary Hilton whose names we will never know. For the hiking community, Hilton's spree left a scar. National forests had always been seen as safe places, wild, but not dangerous in the way cities were. After Hilton, that illusion cracked. Hikers grew more cautious. Families canceled trips. For months after Meredith Emerson's death, Blood Mountain stood nearly empty, its once busy trails abandoned. Today, hikers still climb those paths, but many walk with Hilton's story in the back of their minds, a reminder that danger can take the shape of an old man with a dog and a smile. Now in his late 70s, Hilton sits in prison, awaiting execution in Florida while serving life sentences elsewhere. He will never walk the forest again, but his story lingers, told in courtrooms, in FBI files, and in the whispers of hikers who glance over their shoulders on lonely trails. The forests never changed. The trails where Meredith Emerson hiked, where John and Irene Bryant walked, where Cheryl Dunlap disappeared today, they look the same as they did before Gary Hilton ever set foot there. The rivers still cut through the valleys. The leaves still fall in golden layers each autumn. Hikers still lace their boots, leash their dogs, and head into the silence of the trees. But for those who know the story, the silence feels different. It was here, in places meant for peace, that Hilton turned trails into traps. He was not a phantom. He was not a genius criminal mastermind. He was a drifter, an aging man with thinning hair and a tired dog. And that made him all the more terrifying, because it meant he could be anyone. The hiker you pass on the trail, the man parked at a campground, the stranger who smiles and waves before falling in step behind you. For families like the Bryants, the Dunlaps, and the Emersons, Hilton's crimes will never fade. Their loss is permanent. Their grief a lifelong companion. But their stories remind us of something larger: the fragility of safety, the way danger can hide in plain sight, and the courage it takes for investigators to follow every lead until justice is done. Gary Hilton will never walk free again. His days are spent behind steel doors, his future decided by the courts. In a way, he still walks those trails. His shadow lingers in the minds of hikers, in the caution of families, in the way people glance over their shoulders when the woods fall quiet. The forests remain. Beautiful, vast, and silent. But silence can cut both ways. It can be peace, or it can be the cover for a predator. And sometimes, the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in nightmares. They're the ones you meet in daylight, smiling, walking the same path as you.